First, I've been now living in Joburg for 5.5 years and working with whole systems transformation and culture change and working with senior leaders around, you know, them engaging with the full authentic aspect of themselves. And what I do now is really what we pioneered at ANZ in 2000 and going forward. So ANZ, short for Australian and New Zealand Banking Group, top 100 banks in the world, 30 countries, 5th largest company in Australia, largest in New Zealand, largest bank in the Pacific Islands, which I guess isn't, you know, much sort of shake to fame because the Pacific Islands are pretty small. 33,000 staff, 6 million customers, 43 billion market cap. And the time that I led this journey with ANZ was between 2000 and 2004, but it continued with my successor for 4 more years before the then CEO, John McFarlane, decided to retire and move on in his life. McKinsey considered the work that we did to be 10 to 15 years ahead of the curve. And in my experience working globally, as I still do, I still think that it is the essential case study that organisations can look to and learn from that describes and gives motivation to maximising the real potential of all of the individuals and people who choose to come into our environments to work for us. And for those people who are working in organisations where we have a customer focus and relating to the customer with heart and with authenticity, we saw here that ANZ, which was struggling around in 1999 as really being very unloved by the customer, started to outstrip and in fact, apart from the rural, the regional banks, which of course were far more community-based, ANZ outstripped its peers significantly. So, bank with a human face. This was the inspiring thought. The bank with a human face. In Australia, bank bashing was a national sport. If you think of the way Australia was formed, its culture, it was a penal colony. Apart from South Australia, all of the states in Australia were settled by convicts, shipped off from England. And so part of the reason, and I'm also going to be a little bit kind of crude because Australians are, not that I am, I'm a New Zealander, but also an Australian, I picked up a few bad habits. This Australian thing about, you know, FU, which we get from the Australian cricket team a lot, comes from a deep distrust of anything that has to do with authority, anything that has to do with anything big. And the tall poppy syndrome is a threshing machine that knocks everybody down to size. So this idea that everyone could be great and be larger than life and access and use all of their potential was almost heresy in that kind of environment. So the bank with a human face. These are some of the metrics that in fact we were tracking over time around the customer, around our community, because of course our communities were the ones who were so distrustful and mistrustful of the banking industry as a whole. Our shareholders, of course, because they wanted returns that justified their investment, and our people. So we looked to attend to all of the stakeholders within this approach, and if organisations are going to go for this sort of thing, my view is it needs to tackle the whole system. And it has to do that overtly and consciously. But things weren't always like this. The bank almost failed in the early 90s. We had a big position in Asia, and for what reason we have no idea. And of course when the Asian crisis hit, we were caught with our pants down. And also we had a big position in organisations like Enron and Marconi. So when they failed, we lost billions of dollars. And how do you then explain that to the shareholder, that you've sunk money into an organisation like Enron? So the image of the organisation was tarnished. And we were seen as being put up there alongside those Enrons of the world. So you can imagine how the people working for the organisation felt about that. The CEO, who was then in charge, and the board had very public arguments and backbiting and accusations that was flashed across the media. It was very nasty. Bank bashing, as I said, a national sport. The Bankers Association paid 2 radio talk show hosts in Sydney over $1 million to say nice things about banks. And they got found out. And in the mind of the Australian public, the image of bankers went below used car salespeople and politicians, which was pretty low in terms of on the trustonometer. So, you know, this is where the industry was languishing, and because there were 5 big banks in Australia, Australia was fighting it out between number 4 and 5 at the bottom of the heap. So how is it going to grow? It can't possibly grow from that position. They brought in a new CEO in 1997, John McFarland, who was the one who led this. He was known as a toe cutter. He had a CBE from the Queen in the UK. He was a Scot. He was very canny with money, as they are. But he came in and he slashed the people from 45,000 to 31,000 in 3 years. He sold off businesses. He cut almost to the bone. And the organisation in 2000 posted record profits. We were the darling of the markets. But if you disaggregated the balance sheet, what you saw was not so pretty. You saw, in fact, that the profitability was coming from a declining cost base rather than a growth in revenue. And he was also canny enough to recognise that this couldn't go on forever. And not all organisations actually realise this. They become addicted to cutting the costs. And so they end up cutting their heart out as part of that process. So there was this realisation that we had to do more than perform for the markets. We had to grow. And how were we going to grow when our people were beaten into the earth and were suffering this kind of survivor mentality, which is, you know, can destroy the heart and the fabric of an organisation. It's not necessarily the people who leave. You know, they go on to their new lives and they may or may not forgive, but they leave it behind and they get on with it. But the people who survive are always in fear that, am I next? So we needed to develop a different culture, a culture that was actually a 180-degree turn from what had been created through those years, where the self-esteem of the people in the organisation was at rock bottom. So we started on this cultural transformation, looking at transformation with a big T, which was about realising and engaging the hearts and minds of everybody. So this is where we were. We were actually a mature bank, a mature organisation. And in fact, what often happens, and if you look at you know, the FTSE or the Dow Jones or whatever, the number of companies that were around 30 years ago are not around today. And it's not just because they have failed, a la Lehman Brothers. What's happened is they've been gobbled up because they haven't kept their eye on the ball and they haven't consciously renewed themselves. BlackBerry, who's got BlackBerries in the room? Right? Of course, they got into the situation where they felt that this is the be-all and end-all. There can be nothing that can beat the BlackBerry until the iPhone. So in our case, there were in fact a bunch of indirect drivers that were operating in the environment. So whenever we go into this thing, we need to look at the environment that we're in, the things that are out of our control as an organisation. And there were also some direct drivers. War for talent, we know about this. We know about it in South Africa. It's alive and well. The globalisation of capital markets. Someone sitting in New York can put a sell order on your stock and people will sell. You've got no control over that. You know, we all know about Twitter, Facebook. We know when BP polluted the Mexican waters that the CEO went out on a fancy yacht. And I was following on Twitter. I knew he wouldn't survive. See, everything is transparent. You can no longer hide. No one can hide anymore. And sometimes it's even just innuendo. It doesn't even necessarily need to be true. We look at the whistleblower at Goldman Sachs. Muppets, isn't that what they called their very wealthy, well-heeled clients? I mean, if I were a Muppet, I'd be taking my money somewhere else, thank you very much. And Lloyds. So the Lloyds Bank in the early 90s had the lowest cost-to-income ratio of any bank in the world. And this was what ANZ was heading for. They wanted to lower their cost-to-income ratio. And what happened in the Lloyds case is one day an analyst stood up and said, "Where's your growth strategy?" And they didn't have an answer, and they discounted the share price, and Lloyds almost failed. Just on that one question. And we couldn't afford that. Then there was this internal thing around the ANZ strategy, which was to become a niche player through each of our business lines. All of our stakeholders, apart from our shareholders, hated us. The government was threatening re-regulation. Our people hated us. And also, we found that Tobin's Q told us there was more of a percentage coming from intangibles in the share price. So how do we build the intangibles, which are around the culture, the leadership brand, those kinds of things? So we set two aspirations, high-performance culture, and this is a word that's bandied around all the time in business, but this is what was driving it. It was to become the bank with a human face. How could we be human to ourselves, to our community, to our people, even to our shareholders? And this was the definition of high performance. It's a pretty meaty, edgy, hard-nosed definition. However, the way we wanted to create that was through this, the marriage of the soft stuff into the heart and the fabric of the organisation. The soft stuff, which we all know is the hard stuff, because you're dealing with the unique attributes of each human being. And the idea was to get rid of this entropy, this high level of entropy, this high level of dysfunction, political game playing, backbiting and such like blame that was going on in the organisation. And this is the definition, much like in physics. It's the degree to which the organisational energy is directed into unproductive activity such as politics, for which is not only no return, but there's actually a negative return on investment. So we now go on to what was ultimately called breakout. And I know when we coined this term, someone sort of said, well, most people are trying to break into banks, not break out of them. And it was part of a larger agenda, which was called Perform, Grow and Breakout. John McFarlane had spent 3 years focusing on performing, which was delivering on promises to the market, because previously we'd made huge promises to the market and never delivered on them. We'd have all these excuses, oh, this happened and it wasn't our fault, and yada, yada. But they don't care. The markets don't care in the capitalist system. Then there was the growth. We'd been so busy cutting costs that actually the mindset was so clouded that we couldn't see opportunity to grow. We'd cut the innovation, the creativity to the bone. And it actually had to happen through this, through the breakout. And it was really what Debbie was talking about. It was based on finding the essence or the soul of the organisation, the one that people could relate to and want to be part of as a free choice. So it was a key binding aspect. Began in 2000. We brought in McKinsey. They worked with us for 6 months in the start-up. We did a huge diagnosis, design phase. What we need to realise is that this work had never been done before on this scale. McKinsey had worked with a small call centre that was going up against Telstra, which was the big monolith telecom, which was about 300 people. They'd worked with 4,000 people at Woodside Petroleum, but this was an organisation of 31,000 people in multiple countries, multiple cultures, very diverse. And this was the key, that it had to become a way of life. It wasn't just an intervention and then we go back to business as usual. We actually had to transform, and it had to become the way we did business around here. It ultimately became a point of differentiation. And, you know, we were very big on the IQ because, you know, we were numbers people. We had a lot of economists and number crunchers. But what we needed to engage, you know, was the emotional heart, but also the spiritual motivation of people. To recognise that in everybody's life, we sometimes ask the question, why am I here? Why am I doing what I'm doing? If I lie on my deathbed and I look back, have I had a life well lived? So I led the transformation team that did this. We were not in HR. So this is one of the diagnostics we used, and the performance ethic. McKinsey told us that in fact, in all high-performing organisations that consistently perform through time, there were these 5 aspects that they needed to be distinctive on in the top 10% against their benchmark, against their peers. This is where we were. This is the Australian average. This isn't even the global average. And as you can see, organisational approach was really about the politics and, you know, how we actually got things done. It was the lowest that McKinsey had ever seen at the 15th percentile. So, and then there were 2 sets of levers, the coordination and control and the motivation levers, and you needed to choose one to be distinctive of. We took this to the board and they were absolutely shocked. They said, well, how come we're making money if this is going on? I said, well, yeah, we're making money now out of cutting costs, but it won't continue. We can promise you that there's going to be a nosedive if we don't do something about that. So they backed it. The second diagnostic, and some of you may know it, we used the Barrett 7 levels of organisational consciousness and surveyed the organisation around the current values in the organisation. And we'll come to it a bit later, but the current value that was number 1, voted for by all the people, was cost reduction. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't get up out of bed every morning, you know, hell-bent and happy to go out and reduce costs, you know. But that's what people were being served up. I mean, the CFOs love to do that. But, you know, real people who are in a service industry, it's not what makes their heart beat faster. We also use this model, the influence model, as our design. So this is the whole systems that we had to actually work with to ensure that nothing was left undone. So starting with understanding and conviction, the compelling aspiration, the bank with the human face. It really spoke to the people. Allowing ourselves to bring ourselves to work. How do we see our role in terms of accessing our humanity? The role modelling from the leaders, walking the talk, being congruent, being called on their behaviour and exited, in fact, which happened if they did not get on the bus. Then this whole thing about upskilling, because of course a lot of people didn't actually have the skills to do this. And finally, the non-sexy stuff, redesigning the processes, the systems, in order to support the transformation. And then the key piece, which was around developing personal mastery in our people, giving them the opportunity to find their meaning. We chose 3 key themes. Big themes, 3 is a big number in McKinsey, and they always talk in 3. So the first one was we wanted to live the breakout aspiration and values. We wanted to become the bank with the human face, human in everything we did. We wanted to transform ourselves in how we interacted. We wanted to be distinctive on opportunities and people. So we designed these breakout workshops, which were personal development workshops, to address these 2. And then our charters or our systems redesign addressed these 2 here. And also we had a communication strategy that supported this. So these are transformation workshops, developing personal mastery. The breakout charters were projects that redesigned the system as a structured approach. In the breakout team, we had an internal consulting group that were trained by McKinsey to be diagnosticians working with the business units and the functions. And we also had a bunch of breakout champions. So these were people who were passionate. They had informal leadership. They signed up. They wanted to be out there. And we gave them additional training, and they kind of worked from their own heart, doing their own stuff, as well as doing their day job. So this was the core and the essence, and it was a formally established structure. Values was the core driver. Now, you all know this. You can look at the data anywhere on the internet, that organisations with strong cultures always outperform those without. So we developed the ANZ values not in the boardroom. We developed it via the people. It took ages because we consulted, we had workshops, people drew charts, we had timelines, we did all sorts of stuff. It had been the first time people had been asked anything ever. They were so excited about seeing this coming to fruition. And because the CEO had his own website, he would post bits and pieces and progress and things, and when people came in of a Monday morning, on their screen, on their computers, would come up John's homepage. And he would talk about what happened on the weekend, or what happened with talking to the analysts last week, or he would post stories that people told him, or he would track how we're going with developing the values, and this is the conversations we're having. So people felt involved with the whole thing. Okay, so these are the values. So everybody got a key card that was attached to their security card. On one side was this, aspiration, bank with a human face. 5 values, one for each of our major stakeholders, and a value describing the kind of culture we wanted to develop. Being bold as a bank was something that, you know, really had never been heard of, and also being different. On the back of the card were these words. This was the level 1 through 3 in the Barrett. This was the breakout. This was the level 4 through 7. So these were pieces of language that we adopted to help support us bring this and live this in the organisation. So in the discussions that we had and the decisions that we made, we would have in meetings our key cards, genuinely. And we would ask ourselves the question, things like, you know, is this stretching enough? You know, would one of our competitors make this decision? And if it was no, we'd say, well, maybe we're not being bold enough. We would challenge each other around these. Now, sometimes, as you all know, if you have values that sit around a number of stakeholders, they're not mutually exclusive. You can't please everybody all of the time. So the critical element around this was the ability to say we are making a decision on this situation that will favour our shareholders and maybe not going to favour our customers so much. But we had a commitment when we did that to go to the people to explain why we took that decision the way we did. So there was complete transparency, and we used this language to communicate decisions in the organisation as role modelling what it is we wanted everyone to do by doing it ourselves. Our communication strategy, you know, I think we've all probably seen people, organisations launching values or culture initiatives, and it's all whistles and bells and, you know, coffee mugs and mouse pads and, you know, posters on the wall. We consciously took the pull strategy. We didn't announce anything. We just started doing it. And then as people started to wake up and say, actually, what's going on here? I call it the Harry Met Sally story. You know, if you've ever seen that scene in the cafe when Harry met Sally, because, you know, people would say, well, I want what she's having, right? And wouldn't we all? You know, as women, for example. So we designed this as a pull strategy, and we cascaded it down through the organisation. We developed a core partnership of all of the people who were in any kind of communications capacity to actually drive the communications and ensure that it was embedded. And everything needed to relate ultimately to the transformation. So this is how we planned the rollout of initiatives, irrespective of whether they specifically related to breakout or not. We packaged them up so that the initiatives rolled out in a continuous stream, and we used the idea of the S-curve, of building energy to the point of flipping into transforming the consciousness of the organisation as the metaphor for doing that. You don't have to read all this. But John was very big on everybody having their own personal mission statement. And part of the breakout experience was the opportunity to ask ourselves the question, who am I in the world? What's my dream? If I look back over 80 years of life from my 80th birthday party, you know, what do I want to experience? What will I be proud of? You know, if I were to describe myself as a total human being, an authentic self, what would that look like beyond the role or roles that I perform? So every year at the Group Senior Management Conference of the Top 300, he would stand and share his personal mission statements, which is this is an example of, and he would say to the people, if it's not on there, I don't want to know. So don't come to me and ask me to make decisions about blah, 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 because I'm not going to. That's what I've got you for. So he was very strong on this. So the breakout duck, we also had to have a bit of fun, because that was one of our words. And the breakout duck was our motto. And I remember when we first came up with this idea of the breakout duck jumping out of the shell and cracking the shell, we called it, can't get back in. You know, once it's like a baby. Once you're out, you're out. You know, can't get back in the womb as much as sometimes I'm sure we'd like to. And of course, ducks fly in formation and support each other as they migrate across the planet. So what happened over time was all sorts of metaphors and stories grew up that people created around the duck that we hadn't even envisaged. Some other visible signs, we had the duckometer, which stood in the head office, which showed us how many people were attending the breakout workshops. At the top 300 group management conference, everyone had to stick a flag in the ANZ world with their personal commitment that was then published on the website that they were then held accountable to. And we put and tiles on the floor and all sorts of things. We use the intranet a lot, and so all of the things that the breakout team did had its own branding, had its own positioning, had its own launch, so that we built the brand. We taught everybody in the organisation to meditate, and every office had its own quiet room. Progress. So this was the progress from 2000 to 2003. We made some quite good progress. This was still a bit of a challenge here. We're still just on the Australian average. We had chosen financial, and we had chosen opportunities as our core levers. But what had happened, the reason we didn't choose values as the core motivation is because we thought it was going to be too hard. It was going to be a kind of a next step. And when we saw that actually we'd made this kind of progress, we felt actually we've got almost distinctive opportunities. Let's flip to really driving the values home. So we were very strategic about the different phases. So what we did on the Barrett ranking of current values is we tracked them through time. Now I only have up to 2004 here because it can't get, you need a couple of other slides to get all the rest on. But you can see, here it is coming up, you can see cost reduction. Look how long it took to get down out of the organisation. It wasn't until 2007 that cost reduction fell out of the top 10 as being seen by our people as not being, people were suspicious because of our history. But customer satisfaction wasn't even in here, And then it grows here. And then community involvement, which was winning the trust of the community, does this huge jump to become number 2 in the eyes of the people in terms of the values that we were not just espousing, but living. Knowledge of the values over time. Staff satisfaction over time. Second wave of breakout workshops was this 2-day program that was called Inspiring Leaders. So this was about accessing the leader within. And we talked about everybody being a leader.